We will now hear Brother Sam speak on the subject, When Life Turns Upside Down.
Well, good morning, brothers and sisters and young people, much loved in the Lord. I don't say that lightly. We've been through many years of discipleship together, many of us. Some are new, but many of us have been here for a long time. We're old wood. But we've been through a lot together, haven't we? And that binds us together and helps us understand each other and be a deeper comfort for one another because we know each other better. And so we have an exhortation this morning from the prophet Jeremiah to have a look at. It's a very graphic prophecy, isn't it? It's very dramatic. There's very few stronger words of condemnation against God's people than can be found in Jeremiah. And we've always had this intriguing chapter, haven't we? We've always smirked at the expression, the naughty figs, in the AV as we read it in Jeremiah 24, in verse 2. But we really want to think about the circumstances of these two groups of people, the good and the bad figs of Jeremiah 24 this morning. Think about their circumstances. We know as a matter of, recapping, we know that the fig tree is a symbol of Israel, isn't it? It's used a number of times that way. In Joel 1 and verse 7, just to go through a few, he hath laid my vine waste, and barked my fig tree, the vine and the fig tree, both symbols of Israel. Jeremiah 8 and verse 13, it says of Israel, there were no grapes on the vine, no figs on the fig tree. In Hosea 9 and verse 10, I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree. And in Luke 21, which we're very familiar with, he's just been speaking about Jerusalem being trodden down of the Gentiles for so long, and he talks about the fact that looking at the fig tree and all the trees, they will be a symbol of the breaking out of the nations or movement in the nations, but clearly the fig tree there is used first and primarily of Israel as a sign of Christ's return. So I think the sense here of these baskets, these two baskets which Jeremiah sees that God shows him is the nation of Israel symbolised as offerings. And there's two sort of camps within the nation, aren't they? Symbolised as an offering, as a basket, as a free will offering to God. And one offering will be accepted. It's not perfect. These people needed correction very strongly. We see that in Jeremiah. God had said the nation was backsliding and oppressive and perverse and full of whoredoms and idolatry and corruption and immorality. That quadrant was to be tried and chastened, but God would love them and watch over them and ultimately work for their good. But there was another part of the nation that we see, that the other figs, the bad figs, the evil figs, as it could well be translated, which was rotten, and it wouldn't be chastened by trial, and God wouldn't discipline it out of love so much, and ultimately it would perish. So contrary to expectation, that the group that goes into exile is a group which will be restored, and the group which stays in the land ultimately will be the group which is destroyed. We know that there was 3 Babylonian deportations or captivities, don't we? And I guess part of that just shows how, we understand the Jewish nature is very strong, and that threefold captivity by Babylon coming again and again against this rebellious city just shows, one, the fact that it took 20 years, and the other, the fact that there was 3 of them, just shows what they were like. Babylon came again and again and again to this group of strongly rebellious people. They just kept fighting. So we know the first captivity included Jehoiakim and Daniel and his 3 friends. The second, there was 10,000 taken away, which included Jehoiachin, the king, the princes of the house royal of Judah, and Ezekiel in particular, we note. And then there would be one after this chapter when the city and the temple would be destroyed and Zedekiah would be taken off as their final king. So the timing of Jeremiah 24, the giving of this prophecy, it's a prophecy, isn't it, is after the second captivity and before the third, when Nebuchadnezzar had taken Jehoiachin, or Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, captives with the princes of Judah. The captives were taken, Zedekiah has been set on the throne, and there's one more captivity, the final decimation to come. And so this chapter sort of looks forward and anticipates what's going to happen. The Lord showed me, and behold, 2 baskets of figs were set before the temple of Yahweh. After that, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away captive Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and the princes of Judah with the carpenters and smiths from Jerusalem, and had brought them to Babylon. So the second captivity is done. And there's these 2 baskets of figs. You know, God had said that he was going to take them, as we read in this chapter, take them away for their good. The ones that would go into captivity, it had a positive goal in mind. That's what God had in mind. Let's come across to the letter. If you know Jeremiah, you know that Jeremiah is not all chronological, and people like Uncle Ron Cowie have put a lot of time into collating the chapters, and I've got a little insert which sort of shows roughly the order that he thinks the chapter's coming in. And so 29 is written before this, but let's come across to chapter 29. It's a letter that Jeremiah writes to his people. Jeremiah 29, verse 1. Now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem unto the residue of the elders which were carried away captives, and to the priests, and to the prophets, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. After, so same period as chapter 24, after that Jeconiah the king and the queen and the eunuchs and the princes of Judah and Jerusalem and the carpenters and the smiths were carried away from Jerusalem. So this is when he writes this letter. Thus saith, verse 4, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all that are carried away captives, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem unto Babylon. So he's writing to the ones in Babylon. And he says in verse 5, don't just sit there wondering what to do and how long we're going to be here, and should we be trying to go back to our land or settle where we are? Build ye houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens in Babylon and eat the fruit of them. Take ye wives and beget sons and daughters. Build up your families and the body of the believers of the nation. Keep it alive in captivity. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, that ye be increased there and not diminished. And your relationship to the Babylonians, seek the peace of the city whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto Yahweh for it, for in the peace thereof shall ye have peace. And so this for a Jewish person would be hard to read, hard to accept, wouldn't it? To pray for the peace of the Babylonian captors that had taken them captive, a hard thing to take. But God says, don't rebel, verse 8 and 9. For thus saith Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, let not your prophets and your diviners that be in the midst of you deceive you, telling another message which might be more palatable. Neither hearken to your dreams which ye cause to be dreamed, for they prophesy falsely unto you in my name. I have not sent them, saith Yahweh. For thus saith Yahweh, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you. This won't be just, for a lot of you, just your lifetime. It'll go into your children's lifetime, your grandchildren's lifetime. They will be brought up in Babylon. This requires a different mindset, doesn't it? This isn't a 10-year captivity. This isn't a 2-year captivity. This is a 70-year captivity. Family life will continue. Generations will grow up only knowing life in Babylon. It's a different degree of seriousness that you have to take your planning with that in mind. After 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. So God, and so often God does this, doesn't he? He's now going to project the blessings that he will bring to his people even before he's fully outplayed the judgments that he's brought upon them. And God does this. His people are sinning. he says, I'm going to bring judgments upon you, but beyond the judgments, there's going to be blessings again. And he can't help himself but do that. He says in verse 11, for I know the thoughts that I think toward you. I know my disposition to you, where my heart lies, saith Yahweh. Thoughts of peace, even though you're going into captivity, and not of evil, to give you an expected end, or as the ESV and other translations say, a future and a hope. An expected end, a future and a hope. God's planning for this nation, which morally had degraded so badly. He's planned this captivity, this shock treatment, I think it is largely, that you'll go and you'll see what paganism's like right up close. In its end result, you'll see it full blown in Babylon. And when they came back to the land, they'll be, as one reference, I'm not quite sure where I've got it from my youth, but they came back fiercely monotheistic. It shocked them into being more diligent in their pursuit of the one true God of Israel. Then verse 12, ye shall call upon me, and ye shall go and pray unto me, and I will hearken unto you. You might think, cast off in Babylon, that God has now finished with us and he's out of touch, he's out of reach. No, if you pray, I will hearken unto you, and ye shall seek me. That's what it will make you do. You'll seek me and find me in Babylon when you search for me with all your heart. So captivity wouldn't be a thing that would ostracize them from God in any real sense. God had choreographed their future. These were temporary things. He's got a long-term plan for them. God was present and he was ready and he was willing even in captivity. And so the message of Jeremiah, of his letter, is not to waste time rebelling or reacting negatively against their captivity, or to get down or offside with God, to push him away. Things would be hard, be huge disruptions. There'd be attractions there to fight off as well. And it'd be hard to adjust. Different diet, different food in Babylon, potentially to what they knew. How would you make an income? You just turn up as a captive. And God's saying, build houses and plant vineyards. How? Where? What are the means to make this happen? Be overwhelming, wouldn't it? There'd be cultural differences as well, not just the negative ones of Babylon, but just the general cultural, how to trade, how to communicate with people, all of those things. This was a massive upheaval for these people. God says, seek me and you'll find me. I'll be ready and willing to be called to your side. You know, more than anything for a Jewish person, that they wouldn't be able to worship as they used to. There was no temple for service. Someone to orchestrate, priests, a whole system running that you can just join into. None of that. They wouldn't have that in Babylon. On the Sabbath, what would you do? Sabbath morning, where do you go? How do you worship? They ended up by the rivers of Babylon. It's not really the same, is it, as what they had had? You know, the whole law system, all their infrastructure, all the familiar sites, all the land sites around them which reminded them of their history and of things that had happened in their history, all of that was gone. They were in Babylon. They knew nothing of this place. It reminded them of nothing positive to do with their life and their history with God. And so this would be a huge and a deep probing test of their faith, wouldn't it? Had they really captured the spirit of the law that it was intended to ingrain in their hearts? Would they be able to practice that in Babylon? Would they survive captivity with their faith intact and having grown? Could they grow in Babylon? Or would they shrink and fade into oblivion? You know, in Babylon they had to hold steadfastly onto God, didn't they? You know, this is no different to us today. In the negative circumstances of our life, we still have Romans 8 crying out to us as loud as it ever did. And one of my favourite passages. Let's come across to Romans 8:28. It's easier to see God's hand in the good times, and we know that trial shapes character, and we know that we always talk about developing God's character and developing character, so we know it's necessary, but It's hard as we go through it at times. And we need to pick up the sentiments and put into our heart the sentiments of this verse. And we know that all things, not just the pleasant things, not just the matters of success in our life, not the smooth times only, all things, illness, people passing away, disruptions, major disruptions, family troubles. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to those who love God. If we can just keep that focus, then all of these things shape and mould and bring us closer to him, because we lean on him in the tough times, don't we? We thank him in the good times and we lean heavily upon him when things are difficult. All things work together for good for them that love God, to them that are the called according to his purpose. You see, just like God had a long-term plan, a future and a plan for a hope and a future for his people, a future and a hope, just to put it the right way around, for his people back in Jeremiah, so he does for us. We're the called according to his purpose. From a child, from before I was born, before you were born, God had a plan to call us, to make us his own. And that plan continues through our whole life and right into the future, a future and a hope for us. And everything choreographs in and around that in your and my life. You know, because I think we are so limited, it's hard to really understand how infinite God is, how that divine hand can shape even the number of people in this room's lives. How can he do that? How can he make all things work together for good? How can that be? But God is infinite, isn't he? We marvel in so many ways at the intricacy of his creation, in the big plans he has for the world, but he works in the same way in our lives, and he knows us intimately, and he works things together and moulds them to mould our lives for his benefit. And so we know that from that whole captivity process, a good number did return, over 40,000 people. And as I said, they came back fiercely monotheistic, and they still were in Jesus' day, weren't they? They had gone exclusive in a wrong way, but part of it was that they had learnt what they didn't want to be like when they were in Babylon, and it was still there in Christ's day. So some entered in faith, and others were entered into captivity in faith in Babylon. Others were exercised by that captivity to continue or to develop faithfulness after they've accepted the trial that God was bringing upon them. And so they persisted in Babylon and were blessed there. They didn't harden their hearts. They didn't rebel. We know beautiful characters. Daniel and his three friends have been inspiration to not just Sunday school students, but every time we study it in a Bible class in that deeper level, we're impressed with how deep and profound those people were in their faith. And so God says of these people, if we come back to Jeremiah 24 and verse 5, "Thus saith Yahweh, the God of Israel, like these good figs, so will I acknowledge them that are carried away captive." Acknowledge them. These are not all faithful people at this point. These are people that God will work with and that he knows will respond. Like these good figs, God sees us as good, doesn't he? Even though we're not. We're blemished. We might think we're like the rotten figs. "So will I acknowledge them that are carried away captive of Judah, whom I have sent out of this place into the land of the Chaldeans for their good." And you could colour that in, for their good. "For I will set mine eyes upon them for good. And I will bring them again to this land, and I will build them and not pull them down. I will plant them and not pluck them up." And just in case I don't remember to mention it later, the contrast is with the evil figs in verse 9. "I'll deliver them to be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth for their hurt." So there's the group of good figs in verse 5, going into the land of the Chaldeans, to Babylon for their good. "I'll set mine eyes upon them," verse 6, for good. But in verse 9, the others will be scattered into the nations for their hurt, as an act of judgment on God's behalf. I'll set my eyes upon them for good. God said, I will keep watching this group of people. They're not in my land. They're not in the apple of my eye in the land of Israel, but I will keep my eyes upon them. God was going to work good out of the bad trial. And 70 years later, as we said, over 40,000 would return. And so their families clearly established good routines, didn't they? Faithful policies in families that would see them through these new circumstances. So the insecurity was a trial. In itself, it was a sign of God's loving, corrective chastening, a trial to endure. And I feel that really strongly applies to our own circumstances. COVID's not tough on us right at the moment. It has been, but it is much tougher for other people. But the instability of our times is a test. It is a trial, isn't it? We struggle with it. And this morning's exhortation is to ask if we're exercised by this irregularity, by this disruption. Are we still reaching out in whatever ways we're able to at the time? Are we locking into the things that really matter? You know, in one sense, we've got more time than we used to, with a bit less on. Though some things perhaps take a little bit longer than they did as well before. But there's a potential for, and I'm sure you've all felt this, for negative reaction to our circumstances, to be angered by them, as our freedoms are curtailed, or to be frustrated and feeling our natures want to pushing back against the rules of the land we live in. We want to push off. We feel that, I've felt, that rebellious feeling that wants to push back on all of this. It's annoying. We can just feel like withdrawing. It's too hard. I don't want to wear a mask to the meeting. It's too hard. I don't want to do it. We can just, we're building an extension at the moment. It's very tempting just to pull back to DIY for a moment. Just spend a few months tidying out my house before we go forward, because, it's maybe it doesn't matter if I'm not at the meeting quite so much for a while, whilst there's restrictions and things on. Sunday school and Bible class. We need to, wherever within the limits of what we can do, build these things up, make them strong, not for ourselves necessarily so much, but for our brothers and sisters, so they can see our love and our faith and our enthusiasm, and we can share those wonderful times together. So the disruptions of our time are no doubt a test by God. They're a test of our inner faith, what it's made of, what it's built on, of what character and strength it is, what holds it up. Our structures have been at times greatly dishevelled. There's definitely less certainty about the place. There's options for how we use our time, whether we tap in, when we tap in. So the exhort this morning is really just an exhortation to faithfulness in the last days in simple terms, to not lose sight of the goal that we have in mind. This plan of God's for a future and a hope for these people, it worked. You see in verse 7 of Jeremiah 24, I will give them a heart to know me, that I am Yahweh. Through the trial, they would deeply come to appreciate who God was, his righteousness, his justice, his mercy, his long suffering in his long-term plan for them. I will give them a heart to know me. That's what God wanted, wasn't it? He wanted their heart, and until he used these shocking circumstances in their life, it didn't twig their heart, it didn't set it alight, or they didn't acknowledge and understand God properly, but through the trial they would come to know God more deeply. They would lean upon him, they would pray more earnestly. And they shall be my people. They shall be my people, and I will be their God. There'll be an ownership. He'll see them as his own. He'll see that reflection we keep talking about of God's character. And they would own God. They would want Yahweh to be their God. Back in their land, they'd been hankering after the gods of Egypt and of Babylon and every other nation around them, the Moabites and the Ammonites and all the other gods, are trying to take as much in as they could. But in captivity, they would focus in. And I will be their God. That's what they'll want, Yahweh to be their God. For they shall return unto me with their whole heart. With their whole heart. The result of God's planning of their future. So I think that's the beautiful part of the story, and I just want to reflect for a little while on the flip side in the evil figs, this spirit of rebellion as it is. And the story, I guess, is in the end of the record of Kings. So let's come back to 2 Kings 25 and just see how it all plays through. Second Kings, let's pick up 24, verse 20. For through the anger of Yahweh it came to pass, we're in the times of Zedekiah, he's just taken to the throne in verse 17. For through the anger of Yahweh it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out of his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, he only reigned 11, so this is pretty near the end, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon came, he and all his host, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and they built forts against it round about, and the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. Things started to run out. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine prevailed in the city. The squeeze came on. The food started to really shorten up, and there was no bread for the people of the land. And ultimately, the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls. Sounds like Afghanistan, which is by the king's garden. Now the Chaldeans were against the city round about, and the king went the way toward the plain. And the army of the Chaldeans pursued after the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. And all his army, meant to be loyal men, were scattered from him because of his poor leadership. So they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon to Riblah, and they gave judgment upon him. That's sort of just north in Syria. It was the base of the Babylonians in all these sieges and raids that they were doing through the land of Israel and in the north. And they gave judgment upon him. And they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him with fetters of brass, and carried him to Babylon. And so this is the fate of the king himself. Through abandoning God, God abandons him in this way. His sons are slain before his eyes, before he's blinded and taken in chains to Babylon. In verse 11, that people are carted off. There's evidently people it's in Judea. It's a fairly large area, and some people are left with each group that's taken, and there's still more to take. You keep on thinking, I thought they're all gone, but there's actually still more there, and that sort of makes sense with lots of towns and lots of cities around Jerusalem through Judea, where the Chaldeans would round up certain numbers of people, but there'd still be some left, and still some left, and still some left. And we know that some are ultimately left in the land. Now the rest of the people, verse 11, that were left in the city, and the fugitives that fell away to the king of Babylon, with the remnant of the multitude, did Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carry away. But the captain of the guard left of the poor of the land to be vine dressers and husbandmen. You don't want a large piece of land going untended and unprofitable, I guess. Well, when we come down to verse 18 and 19, a few more are taken away as well, a few more of the leaders that were left still at this time. And the captain of the guard took Saraiah, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the second priest, and 3 keepers of the door. And out of the city he took an officer that was set over the men of war, and 5 men of them that were in the king's presence, which were found in the city, and the principal scribe of the host, which mustered the people of the land, and 70 men of the people of the land that were found in the city. And Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, took these and brought them to the king of Babylon to Riblah. So these are all potential leaders. And the king of Babylon smote them and slew them at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So Judah was carried away out of their land. Well, Nebuchadnezzar then sets up Gedaliah over the remnant that are in the land. So still he wants someone governing, and he obviously thinks Gedaliah is a steady hand about the place, and so he sets him up. He says, I want you to govern the people that are left in the land. But that doesn't last long, as we know. Let's keep reading verse 22. As for the people that remained in the land of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon left, even over them he made Gedaliah the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, ruler. And when all the captains of the armies, they and their men, heard that the king of Babylon had made Gedaliah governor, there came to Gedaliah to Mizpah even Ishmael the son of Nethaniah, and Johanan the son of Kareah, and Seraiah of Tanhumath, and the Netopathite, and Jaazaniah the son of a Maacathite, they and their men. And Gedaliah sware to them and to their men, and said unto them, so this is God's message, isn't it? Fear not to be the servants of the Chaldeans. Dwell in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it shall be well with you. But it came to pass in the 7th month, there's this rebellious spirit, that Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, of the seed royal, so he's got some sort of status, he wants leadership again, came, and 10 men with him, and smote Gedaliah, that he died, and the Jews and the Chaldeans that were with him at Mizpah, his supporters. And all the people, both small and great, and the captives of the armies arose and came to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. So they've not been carried away in the original captivity. They're given an opportunity to stay in the land and given a ruler and time there, and they're still rebelling, and they still knock off Gedaliah and establish Ishmael as their leader, and then they realise that the Babylonians are likely to come and slaughter them again, so they run off to Egypt. It's this spirit, it's fighting against the circumstances despite what God has said so long ago, outlining exactly what would happen in their future. Well, we know that when they flee to Egypt, to avoid the expected retribution by Babylon, trouble follows them there. If we come across to Jeremiah, back to the narrative in Jeremiah 41. We might just come across to 42, actually. We'll just push ahead a little. Let's pick up from verse 42. So when they go into Egypt, there is still a rebellious spirit, a very strong rebellious spirit when they get into Egypt. In verse 13. But if you say, we will not dwell in this land, this is even in Egypt, neither obey the voice of Yahweh our God, saying no, this is when they are still in the land of Judah, saying no, but we will go into the land of Egypt, where we shall see no war, nor hear the sound of the trumpet, nor have hunger of bread, and there will we dwell. And now, therefore, hear the word of Yahweh, ye remnant of Judah. Thus saith Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, if ye wholly set your faces to enter into Egypt, and go to sojourn there, then it shall come to pass that the sword which ye feared shall overtake you there in the land of Egypt, and the famine whereof you were afraid shall follow close after you there in Egypt, and there ye shall die. So shall it be in all the men that set their faces to go into Egypt to sojourn there. They shall die by the sword, and by the famine, and by the pestilence, and none of them shall remain or escape from the evil that I will bring upon them. For thus saith Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, as mine anger and my fury hath been poured forth upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so shall my fury be poured forth upon you when ye shall enter into Egypt, and ye shall be an execration and an astonishment, like an oath, and a curse and a reproach, and ye shall see this place no more. Yahweh has said concerning you, O ye remnant of Judah, go ye not into Egypt. Know certainly that I have admonished you this day, for ye dissembled in your hearts when ye sent unto me Yahweh your God, saying, pray unto us, unto Yahweh our God. And according unto all that Yahweh our God shall say, so declare unto us, so will we do. So that they had appealed to him, tell us what God wants. But he said, you dissembled. You had no intention of doing what God asked. And so even when they go into Egypt, they're corrupt in Egypt, and they're offering burning incense unto the God of heaven, the Queen of heaven, even when they're in Egypt. So Babylon follows not just through Judea, but goes down into Egypt and brings judgments down there upon these people which have turned away from God. So for all God's planning with these people, and I have to mention that where's Jeremiah? Jeremiah ends up getting carted, forcefully taken down to Egypt as well, and you can't help but think, well, why would God do that? Except that still God wants his voice to be amongst those people. Still God wants them to repent if there's any chance of it. Why else? Why not just abandon them to Egypt and bring the Babylonians down and destroy them there? But even in Egypt, there's a prophet of God, if any of them softened their hearts and wanted to come to speak to him. And so, back in Jeremiah 24, this spirit of rebellion, Jeremiah's assessment was these figs were so bad you just couldn't even eat them. They were just so bad. The good figs, very good, he says, but the bad, so bad you couldn't eat them. So rebellious, so unmalleable, so stubborn. Jeremiah's assessment was you just can't eat these figs. God could no longer work with them. They had shut their hearts. And so, as we said, it's easy for the disruptions in our time to upset us. But here's a clear chapter, which I think that the point of the chapter is how are you going to respond to trial, stress, trouble, judgment? How are you going to respond to that? Where's your heart going to lie? Are you going to grow by it? Or are you going to be pushed away from God? Are you going to be exercised by it? There's every reason to think. We know from Luke 21 that it talked about pestilence in the end times as a sign of Christ's return. This has been a major disruption. It's a sign you really can't ignore, can you? It's worldwide. It's probably as massive as anything in our time in terms of how broad spread the effect of it was. We all saw 9/11 on screens and in the news and all of that, but this has really affected such a massive percentage of the people in the world. Huge distress of nations with consternation. COVID has shut down whole economies, hasn't it? It's stifled trade and industry. It's pressured relationships, and in terrible ways. And it's cost billions, which is loading up the weight of this burden on economies. There's so much more going on in our world, and we need to talk, I think, more about current events. It's not a common subject amongst our whole ecclesia. I think I'd encourage us to talk more about it because I think it is encouraging. The Ukraine at the moment want to get the Crimea back again off Russia. They're pushing that way, and we know actually that Russia wants to take the whole of Ukraine. So there's going to be friction there. Putin has knocked it off as a ridiculous idea that they should have Crimea back again. But that's going to put friction into the system, isn't it? Russia's finally said to Israel in Syria, no, we're not just going to let you come in here and act in impunity. We've had this agreement in the past where you can fly in here and do what you like and we'll just turn a blind eye. And they're saying, no, we don't actually want that anymore. You need to sort of ask before you do things in Syria. So Russia's pushing back. There's not that open relationship, however tenuous we might have believed it was. Israel's enemies, the Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, are really emboldened by what we've seen in Afghanistan. They've seen the Taliban just walk in, displace America, and run the place. And they think, well, strike, if you can do it there, why can't we do it over here? And who's going to do anything about it? America did nothing in Afghanistan about it. So there's an emboldening of Israel's enemies. And there's strong rhetoric from Israel. Their Defence Minister, Benny Grant, he said just recently, based on that ship that got taken out off the coast of Oman, the Israeli ship, he said that we're ready to attack Iran and we won't be waiting for America to back us. If we have to go it alone, we'll go it alone. So imagine what Iran think about that. Little Israel think they might come and attack us. So brothers and sisters, in these times, there's so much to lift up our chins about and to look forward to. What we've inherited in our understanding of the truth of God's scriptures are so right and so true and culminating in every possible way. We've got each other to work together with, and we've got to support each other, show the care that we need in our household here. We've got to have that warm-hearted spirit toward one another and build each other up. There'll be difficult times. There's emotionally pressured times for people all around the place. And when you feel the pinch yourself, it's when you might just pull back, from sharing. But there's others in need, and there's always special care that we can show to our brothers and sisters. So often we understand the truth of the scriptures and we value that, and God does clearly as well. He's put 1,500 pages of truth in front of us. But so often in the judgment passages, we're judged upon our reaction to one another and our care of one another. Matthew 25 ends that way, doesn't it? With the parable of the sheep and goats, judged on how we have cared for one another. That's what God really is interested in. Those that are faithful in much, in least, will also be faithful in much. So let's stay together in these times, brothers and sisters. As we've got more time, let's pick out a good book to read. Let's pick out someone that we haven't taken notice of before to extend our love to. I want to leave you finally with a non-biblical quote, but one from a well-loved brother, Brother Harry Tennant, who said, "The best is yet to come."